The official disinvitation arrived not with a bang, but with a curt, almost dismissive email from my younger sister, Clarissa. The subject line simply read, "Update regarding the wedding." The body of the message was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive condescension, a form of communication at which Clarissa was a true virtuoso. "Dearest Marcus," it began, her use of my full name a familiar, formal distancing tactic. "After much careful consideration, and in the interest of ensuring a harmonious and stress-free atmosphere on our special day, Richard and I have decided it would be best if you did not attend the wedding ceremony or the reception. We know you'll understand. It's simply for the best. We'll celebrate with you privately at a later, more appropriate time. My name is Marcus Thorne, 52 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I have been a senior partner at a law firm specializing in complex real estate transactions and commercial property litigation. My world revolves around contracts, title deeds, zoning regulations, and the meticulous, often labyrinthine, paper trails that underpin the ownership of every significant piece of property in this city. Clarissa's fiancé, Richard Sterling, was a man whose own paper trail, particularly his rather creative business dealings, I had become intimately, if unwillingly, familiar with over the past few years. My disinvitation, I knew with a cold, hard certainty, had little to do with family harmony and everything to do with my quiet, professional disapproval of the man she was about to marry, a disapproval I had voiced to her, in private and with considerable fraternal concern, on several occasions. It seemed my concerns had been not just dismissed, but actively, and rather publicly, rebuked. I sat in my quiet, oak-paneled office, the email glowing with an almost malevolent light on my monitor, and I felt not the sting of familial rejection, but the familiar cold clicking into place of a litigator's mind identifying a clear and rather egregious breach of, well, if not contract, then certainly of basic human decency. And, as it happened, a rather significant strategic miscalculation on their part. What Clarissa, in her social climbing, fiancé-defending zeal, had clearly forgotten, or perhaps never bothered to ascertain in the first place, was a small, seemingly insignificant detail about the venue she had chosen for her lavish, stress-free wedding. The venue, a magnificent historic country estate known as the Sterling Manor, no relation to her fiancé, though the shared name was a coincidence Clarissa clearly found auspicious. With its rolling hills, its grand ballroom, and its impeccably manicured gardens, was indeed one of the most exclusive and sought-after wedding locations in the region. It was also, as of a quiet, off-market transaction 3 months prior, which I had personally negotiated on behalf of a private investment consortium I represented, a property whose ultimate ownership now resided with a discreet holding company for which I, Marcus Thorne, served as the principal legal counsel and managing partner. In essence, my sister had just, with breathtaking arrogance, banned me from a wedding being held at a venue that I, for all intents and purposes, owned. The irony was so rich, so profound, it was almost delicious. I leaned back in my leather chair, a slow, humorless smile touching my lips. Clarissa and Richard wanted a harmonious, stress-free wedding, free from my disapproving and apparently disruptive presence. They had no idea that the harmony of their entire event, the very ground beneath their perfectly polished wedding shoes, was subject to a series of contractual obligations, venue regulations, and liability clauses that I, the band older brother, knew by heart because I had, in fact, helped to draft them. My initial plan had been to simply endure the wedding, to attend as a dutiful brother, to maintain a polite, if cool, distance, and to quietly hope that my sister would not come to regret her choice of husband too profoundly. But this email, this formal public act of exclusion, had changed the terms of engagement. This was no longer just a matter of family disapproval. It was a challenge. And a litigator, a good litigator, never, ever backs down from a challenge, especially one so poetically and so comprehensively ill-advised. I picked up my phone and dialed my solicitor, Alastair Finch, a man whose appreciation for the subtle, elegant deployment of legal leverage was matched only by my own. "Alastair," I began, my voice calm, precise, the voice of a lawyer outlining the preliminary facts of a new and rather promising case. I believe we need to schedule a site inspection at the Sterling Manor for this coming Saturday afternoon to review certain compliance issues regarding a scheduled event. And perhaps, I added, a hint of steel in my voice, to have a quiet, private word with the bride and groom about the rather interesting termination clauses in their venue rental agreement. The harmonious, stress-free atmosphere Clarissa so desired was about to be subjected to a rather rigorous and entirely unexpected legal and contractual audit. And I, the band, older brother, the disinvited guest, was about to make an appearance at her wedding after all. Not as a guest, however, but as the man who owned the place, and who held all the cards. The history of my relationship with Clarissa and with her fiancé, Richard Sterling, was a long and rather depressing chronicle of my sister's ambition and Richard's avarice. Clarissa, 5 years my junior, had always been the glittering one, while I was quiet, studious, drawn to the sober logic of the law. Clarissa was a social butterfly, her entire life a seemingly effortless ascent through the city's most desirable social circles. Her currency was charm, her primary asset a kind of ruthless, single-minded determination to align herself with wealth and status, a quality she had likely inherited from our own ambitious, socially conscious mother. I had, for years, played the role of the steady, reliable, if somewhat boring, older brother. I had paid her university tuition, co-signed the lease on her first fashionable apartment, offered quiet, often unheeded financial advice. I loved her, of course, in that complex, often exasperating way one loves a sibling whose life choices are a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. But our worlds, our values, had long since diverged. Then came Richard Sterling. He had appeared on the scene about 2 years prior. A charismatic, handsome property developer with a flair for self-promotion and a portfolio of ventures that, upon closer inspection, seemed to be built more on speculative hype and leveraged debt than on any solid financial foundation. He had swept Clarissa off her feet, dazzling her with expensive gifts, whispered promises of a shared empire, and a vision of a life that perfectly mirrored her most extravagant fantasies. I, however, had been less impressed. My professional instincts, honed by years of dissecting complex property deals and identifying fraudulent schemes, had immediately flagged Richard as a high-risk entity. A discreet due diligence inquiry, conducted through my own professional network, had confirmed my suspicions. Richard Sterling was a classic charlatan, a man who lived on the precipice of financial ruin, his lavish lifestyle funded by a precarious pyramid of loans, investor capital from dubious sources, and a series of barely legal and morally bankrupt real estate flips. He was, in short, a con artist in a bespoke suit. I had tried, gently but firmly, to warn Clarissa. I had presented her with the facts, the evidence of Richard's shaky financial standing, the whispers of disgruntled former partners, the red flags that were as numerous and as glaring as the warning lights on a failing nuclear reactor. She had refused to listen. "You're just jealous, Marcus," she had accused, her eyes flashing with a defensive fury. "You can't stand to see me happy, to see me with a man who isn't afraid to take risks, to live a big life. Not like you, with your dusty old law books and your cautious, boring investments." Our relationship had fractured after that, the old, easy affection replaced by a cool, strained formality. She had made her choice, and her choice was Richard Sterling and the glittering, if entirely illusory, future he promised. Her decision to ban me from her wedding was, I now understood, not just an act of petty retaliation for my disapproval. It was a strategic necessity on her part. My presence, my quiet, knowing gaze, my very existence as a man who knew the truth behind her fiancé's carefully constructed facade was a threat to the illusion she was so desperate to maintain, particularly on the day she intended to legally and financially bind herself to him. My own acquisition of the Sterling Manor, the venue she had so ironically chosen for her nuptials, had been a business transaction, not a personal one, at least initially. The property, a magnificent but financially struggling historic estate, had been on the verge of bankruptcy. The private investment consortium I represented had seen its potential not just as a wedding venue, but as a future boutique hotel and conference center. My role had been to navigate the complex legalities of the acquisition, to untangle the web of debts and liens that encumbered the property, and to establish a new, viable corporate structure for its future operation. It was a challenging, intellectually stimulating project, a perfect application of my professional skills. The fact that my sister had, in her blissful ignorance, chosen to rent my new property for her wedding to the very man whose questionable character had so strained our relationship was a coincidence of such profound, almost cosmic, irony that I had, upon discovering it, actually laughed out loud in the quiet of my office. My initial plan, upon receiving Clarissa's email, had been a simple, elegant one. I would not argue. I would not protest. I would simply enforce the terms of the venue rental contract. A contract which, I knew, contained a rather specific clause regarding the final payment schedule, a clause that stipulated that the outstanding balance, a not insignificant sum of over £50,000, was due in full via certified funds, no less than 72 hours prior to the event. A failure to meet this deadline would result in the immediate and automatic cancellation of the booking, with all deposits forfeited. Given Richard Sterling's notoriously precarious cash flow, I had a strong suspicion that this final payment might present a challenge for him. My solicitor, Alastair Finch, had been tasked with sending a polite but firm reminder to Clarissa and Richard regarding this impending deadline, a reminder that would likely arrive just as their pre-wedding stress levels were reaching their peak. However, Clarissa's decision to formally, and so cruelly, ban me from the event had introduced a new, more personal, variable into the equation. It was no longer just a matter of contractual enforcement. It was now a matter of principle. I decided to escalate my strategy. The site inspection Alastair and I would conduct on the wedding day itself would not just be about reviewing fire safety compliance and liquor license provisions, as we would so innocently claim. It would be about creating a moment of maximum and entirely private leverage. My goal was not to ruin her wedding in front of her guests, however tempting that might be. That would be too crude, too unfinessed. No, my objective was more subtle, more precise. I wanted to confront Clarissa and Richard just before the ceremony in the quiet, gilded splendor of the Manor's bridal suite and to present them with a choice. Not a choice between paying their outstanding bill or having their wedding canceled, but a choice of a far more profound nature. A choice that would involve not just their wedding, not just the Sterling Manor, but also a certain, rather incriminating dossier I had quietly compiled on Mr. Richard Sterling's less-than-legal business practices, a dossier that, if forwarded to the relevant financial authorities, would likely result in a rather more long-term and considerably less luxurious change of residence for the happy groom. The banned older brother, the dusty lawyer, was about to demonstrate that the most powerful contracts are not always the ones written on paper, but the ones forged in the quiet, patient acquisition of undeniable and potentially career-ending leverage. The harmony of Clarissa's special day was indeed about to be audited. The days leading up to Clarissa's wedding were a period of intense, if outwardly calm, preparation on my part, while she and Richard were no doubt consumed with the final, frantic details of their grand nuptial production. Seating charts, floral arrangements, the precise shade of ivory for the buttercream frosting. I was engaged in a rather different kind of event planning, one that involved legal briefs, financial statements, and the meticulous construction of an unassailable case. Alastair Finch, my solicitor, had, as planned, sent a polite but firm reminder to Clarissa and Richard regarding the outstanding balance for the venue rental, due no later than 5 p.m. on the Wednesday before the Saturday wedding. The response from Richard's solicitor, a rather slippery character named Bartholomew Thorne, the name alone seemed to be a red flag in my family's various legal entanglements, was a masterpiece of arrogant prevarication. He claimed a temporary, unforeseen issue with a wire transfer from an overseas investor had delayed the payment, but assured us the funds would be forthcoming imminently, and suggested that, given his client's impeccable financial standing, a small delay should be of no great concern. Alastair's reply had been a model of polite, unyielding professionalism. He had simply, and without comment, resent a copy of the signed rental agreement, with the 72-hour payment clause and its attendant automatic cancellation provision, highlighted in stark, uncompromising yellow. He then added a brief, almost casual, postscript. We note, for the record, that any failure to adhere to the explicit terms of this legally binding contract will, regrettably, leave our client with no alternative but to cancel the event and retain all deposits paid to date. We trust this clarifies the matter. The wire transfer, Alastair later informed me with a dry chuckle, had arrived in our account at 4:58 p.m. on Wednesday, just 2 minutes before the deadline. The first part of my plan had succeeded. I had established, beyond any doubt, that Richard's cash flow was as precarious as I had suspected, and that they were willing to play fast and loose with contractual obligations until forced into a corner. This small victory, however, was merely a prelude to the main event. While Alastair had been engaging in his legal ballet with Thorne, I had been finalizing my own preparations. The dossier I had compiled on Richard Sterling was now complete. It was a comprehensive, meticulously documented account of his more dubious business practices, drawing on public records, discreet inquiries through my own network of financial investigators, and even the sworn affidavits of 2 disgruntled former business partners whom Richard had, in their words, comprehensively fleeced in a previous property development scheme. The dossier detailed a pattern of fraudulent loan applications, of misappropriated investor funds, of a complex web of shell corporations designed to obscure ownership and evade taxes. It was, in short, a prosecutable case, a ticking time bomb that, if delivered to the right authorities, would not just end Richard's career, but likely result in a lengthy and unpleasant period of enforced government hospitality. I had no real desire to see Richard in prison, a thought that, while not without a certain grim satisfaction, seemed a rather excessive response to what was, at its heart, a family matter, however egregious. But the threat of such an outcome, the undeniable leverage that this dossier represented, was a tool of immense power, and I fully intended to use it. The plan for the wedding day itself was simple, elegant, and, I felt, entirely proportionate to the offense. Alastair and I would arrive at the Sterling Manor precisely 2 hours before the ceremony was due to begin, under the guise of our previously mentioned site inspection. We would be dressed not as wedding guests, but in our sober, authoritative business suits, carrying briefcases. We would request a private, immediate meeting with the bride and groom, citing urgent and confidential matters pertaining to the venue contract and site liability. Any attempt to refuse or delay this meeting would be met with a polite but firm reminder that, as the legal representatives of the property's ownership, our authority to inspect, and if necessary, to halt, any event on the premises was absolute. I imagined Clarissa's reaction to our unexpected and entirely unfestive arrival. The panic, the fury, the dawning, horrified comprehension that her carefully constructed, stress-free day was about to be comprehensively audited. Once we had them alone, in the cloying, floral-scented confines of the bridal suite, away from the prying eyes and ears of their guests and wedding planners, the real negotiation would begin. I would not lead with threats, not initially. I would begin by calmly, factually outlining a series of minor, but entirely legitimate, contractual breaches and liability concerns we had just discovered regarding their event plans. Inadequate insurance coverage for their chosen fireworks display, a violation of the venue's noise ordinance policies, a failure to provide a required security bond for potential damages. These would be the opening skirmishes designed to unsettle them, to establish our authority, to make it clear that their tenancy of my property was conditional, precarious. And then, once their initial bluster and defiance had been sufficiently softened by the unyielding language of contractual obligation, I would introduce the true subject of our meeting. I would place my dossier, my meticulously compiled record of Richard Sterling's professional life and crimes, on the ornate Louis XVI table between them. And I would present them with a choice. Not a choice between compliance and cancellation, but a choice between a quiet, private, and mutually agreeable restructuring of their future financial and personal relationship with me, and the alternative, the immediate delivery of a copy of that dossier to the Serious Fraud Office, and the rather spectacular and very public implosion of their wedding, their careers, and their lives. The wedding they had so cruelly banned me from was about to become the venue for the most significant negotiation of their lives. And I, the dusty lawyer, the boring older brother, would be presiding, holding all the cards and dictating all the terms. The harmony of their special day, I suspected, was about to be replaced by the quiet, satisfying hum of a deal being struck, a deal in which the balance of power, at long last, would be decisively and irrevocably restored. The drive to the Sterling Manor on the day of Clarissa's wedding was a study in contrasts. Outside the windows of Alastair Finch's discreetly powerful sedan, the sun shone brightly, illuminating a picturesque landscape of rolling hills and manicured hedgerows. Inside the car, however, the atmosphere was one of cool, focused, almost predatory calm. Alastair, at the wheel, navigated the winding country lanes with his usual unruffled precision. I, in the passenger seat, reviewed my mental checklist, my litigator's mind running through the opening statements, the anticipated objections, the pre-planned counterarguments. My briefcase, containing the dossier on Richard Sterling, rested on my lap, its weight a tangible, reassuring presence. We arrived at the gates of the Sterling Manor at precisely 2 p.m., 2 hours before the scheduled start of the ceremony. A harried-looking wedding planner, a young woman with a clipboard and a headset, tried to intercept us, her face a mask of professional panic at the sight of 2 unsmiling men in dark business suits arriving at such a delicate stage of the proceedings. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she began, her voice a little too bright. "Can I help you? The guests aren't scheduled to arrive for another hour." "We're not guests," Alastair stated calmly, producing his business card. "We are the legal representatives of the property's ownership consortium. We are here to conduct an urgent, pre-event site inspection and have a private word with the clients, Ms. Thorne and Mr. Sterling. Please inform them that we are here and that we require their immediate attendance in the Manor's library." The wedding planner's face paled. The words legal representatives and urgent clearly did not feature in her meticulously planned timeline for a stress-free wedding day. She scurried away, her headset crackling with anxious whispers. We were escorted to the library, a magnificent, oak-paneled room lined with leather-bound books that smelled of history and old money. We waited. The silence was broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner, a steady, inexorable counting down to the moment of confrontation. It took nearly 15 minutes for them to appear. Clarissa entered first, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, her elaborate bridal gown a stark, almost absurd, contrast to the grim set of her jaw. Richard Sterling followed, his usual suave demeanor replaced by a look of wary, defensive apprehension. Their solicitor, Bartholomew Thorne, a man whose reptilian smile didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes, brought up the rear. "Mr. Finch, Mr. Thorne," Thorne began, attempting to seize the initiative. "This is a most unorthodox and highly inappropriate intrusion. My clients are preparing for their wedding. Whatever this is about, it can surely wait until Monday." "I'm afraid it cannot, Mr. Thorne," Alastair replied, his voice as cool and polished as the mahogany table between them. "We have identified several significant breaches of the venue rental agreement, which pose a considerable liability risk to my clients, the property owners. These matters must be addressed immediately before the event can be permitted to proceed." He then, with a calm, almost leisurely precision, outlined a series of minor but legally valid contractual infractions we had identified: the inadequate insurance rider for the fireworks, the unapproved use of an external catering supplier for the champagne fountain, the violation of the local noise ordinance with their planned late-night band. Thorne attempted to bluster, to dismiss these as trivial administrative oversights, but Alastair, armed with the signed contract and an encyclopedic knowledge of its every clause, shut him down at every turn. Clarissa's frustration was mounting, her carefully planned day unraveling before her very eyes. "This is ridiculous," she finally burst out. "You're doing this deliberately, Marcus, to ruin my wedding, because you're jealous." "My motivations, Clarissa," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice quiet but firm, "are entirely irrelevant. What is relevant is the legally binding contract you and Richard signed. A contract you are currently in breach of. A contract which gives us, as the representatives of the venue's ownership, the absolute right to cancel this event, here and now, should these breaches not be immediately rectified." I let that hang in the air for a moment. The threat, however politely phrased, was unmistakable. Their dream wedding was hanging by a very slender and very expensive contractual thread. "However," I continued, my gaze shifting to Richard, who had remained largely silent, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "The matter of the fireworks and the champagne fountain is, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively minor concern. We are reasonable people. We are prepared to overlook these small transgressions on certain conditions." I then reached into my briefcase and withdrew the dossier, its contents bound in a simple, professional-looking blue folder. I placed it on the table between us. It landed with a soft, but distinctly menacing thud. "This," I said, my voice dropping to a lower, more serious register, "is a rather more significant matter. This is a preliminary research file, a due diligence report, if you will, on the business practices of one Mr. Richard Sterling." Richard's face went white. Thorne's reptilian smile vanished completely. Clarissa stared at the folder as if it contained a venomous snake. "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard stammered, his voice losing its usual confident timbre. "My business practices are impeccable." "Are they, Richard?" I replied, my voice like chipped ice. "Are they indeed? Because my research, which includes sworn affidavits from your former partners, Mr. Albright and Mr. Henderson, detailed financial statement from several of your less successful development ventures, and a rather interesting analysis of your use of offshore shell corporations, suggests a rather different narrative. A narrative involving fraudulent loan applications, misappropriation of investor funds, and what the Serious Fraud Office might term a pattern of systematic financial deception." I tapped the folder. "This is just a summary, of course. The full, unexpurgated version, complete with all supporting documentation, is currently with my solicitor. We were contemplating forwarding a copy to the relevant authorities, but then a thought occurred to me. Perhaps there was a more private, a more family-oriented way to resolve this unfortunate matter." The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the frantic, panicked ticking of the grandfather clock. The trap had been sprung. The leverage, undeniable and overwhelming, was now on the table. "So, Richard, Clarissa," I said, my gaze moving between them, "here is our proposal. You will today, before a single guest arrives, sign a legally binding post-nuptial agreement, a draft of which Mr. Finch has so thoughtfully prepared." Alistair slid a second, even thicker, document across the table. "This agreement will stipulate a complete and total separation of all assets between you. It will ensure that my sister, Clarissa, is permanently and irrevocably firewalled from any and all of your, Richard's, current and future financial and legal liabilities. It will also include a rather generous and entirely discretionary trust, established by me, for Clarissa's sole benefit, a trust that will provide her with a comfortable, if not extravagant, income for the rest of her life, contingent, of course, on her immediate and permanent separation from you." Clarissa gasped. Richard looked as though he had been poleaxed. "You want me to leave him?" Clarissa whispered, her voice a mixture of horror and a dawning, almost imperceptible, flicker of something else. "Calculation?" "I'm not making you do anything, Clarissa," I replied. "I'm offering you a choice. A choice between marrying this man, and in doing so, binding yourself to his inevitable financial and legal implosion, or, alternatively, accepting a secure, comfortable, and entirely Richard-free future, funded by the quiet, boring, but remarkably solid proceeds of my dusty old law books. The choice is entirely yours, but you will make it now, before that string quartet plays another note. And Mr. Sterling, I added, turning to him, my voice now devoid of any warmth whatsoever, your choice is even simpler. You will sign this agreement, relinquishing any and all claims on my sister, or I will, with considerable satisfaction, make a single phone call that will ensure your next several wedding anniversaries are celebrated in a far less luxurious and considerably more secure government-managed facility. The band older brother, the useless lawyer, had just presented his final, non-negotiable terms. The wedding of a year had just become a high-stakes, legally binding, hostile takeover of my sister's future. And the final signatures, I knew, were merely a formality. The deal was already done. The immediate aftermath of my ultimatum was a tableau of stunned, almost silent, disbelief. Clarissa, my sister, stared at the post-nuptial agreement Alastair Finch had so calmly placed on the table. Then at me, her face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, fury at my audacity, horror at the revelations about Richard's financial perfidy, and a dawning, almost predatory, gleam of self-preservation in her eyes. Richard Sterling, her handsome, charismatic, and, as it turned out, deeply fraudulent fiancé, seemed to have shrunk, his usual suave confidence utterly extinguished, replaced by the pallor of a man who has just seen the foundations of his entire life, both personal and professional, comprehensively demolished. And Bartholomew Thorne, Richard's solicitor, a man whose professional life was clearly dedicated to navigating the murky waters of legal loopholes and aggressive posturing, looked, for the first time since I had encountered him, genuinely, comprehensively outmaneuvered. He simply sat there, his reptilian smile gone, his face a mask of weary resignation, a silent testament to the undeniable, overwhelming leverage I now held. It was Clarissa who spoke first, her voice a reedy, trembling whisper, a stark contrast to her usual confident, ringing tones. A trust? Funded by you, Marcus? The idea, so antithetical to her lifelong narrative of my supposed inadequacy, seemed to be the most difficult for her to process. Yes, Clarissa, I replied, my voice calm, almost gentle. A trust, sufficient to ensure you can maintain a comfortable, respectable lifestyle, free from financial anxiety. It will not, I should add, be sufficient to fund the kind of extravagant, attention-seeking existence you and Richard have been aspiring to. There will be no more Italian sports cars, no more last-minute trips to Monaco, no more 5,000-pound handbags. But you will be secure, you will be safe, and you will be solvent, a condition which, I suspect, will soon be a rather novel experience for your erstwhile fiancé, Mr. Sterling. Richard flinched as if struck. The casual, almost dismissive, reference to his impending financial implosion clearly hit its mark. And the condition, Clarissa continued, her gaze still fixed on me, her mind clearly working at a furious pace, calculating, assessing, recalibrating, is that I do not marry Richard today, that I leave him. That is a rather blunt, but essentially accurate summary of the proposition. Yes, I confirmed. You have a choice, Clarissa, a clear one. You can bind yourself, legally and financially, to a man whose business empire is a house of cards, a man who is, I assure you, on the verge of catastrophic legal and financial ruin. Or you can choose a different path, a path of quiet security, of financial independence, a path that leads away from this impending disaster. I paused, letting my words sink in. The choice, as I said, is yours. But is a choice you will make now. In this room, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked on, a steady, indifferent metronome marking the final, agonizing moments of Clarissa and Richard's shared, fraudulent dream. Richard finally found his voice, a hoarse, desperate croak. Clarissa, darling, don't listen to him. He's bluffing. He's trying to poison you against me. We can fight this. Thorne? Bartholomew? Tell her. He looked pleadingly at his solicitor. Bartholomew Thorne, however, merely offered a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, his eyes avoiding Richard's. He had seen the dossier. He had understood the implications. He knew, with a lawyer's cold certainty, that this was not a fight they could win. He was already mentally calculating his own exit strategy, distancing himself from his now radioactive client. Clarissa looked from Richard's desperate, sweating face to my own calm, unyielding expression. She looked at the damning dossier on the table, then at the thick, legally binding postnuptial and trust agreement beside it. The litigator in me could almost see the scales of justice, or at least of ruthless self-interest, tipping in her mind. Her love for Richard, I had long suspected, was a transactional one, an investment in a future of wealth and status he had promised her. Now, faced with the irrefutable evidence that this investment was not just underperforming, but was, in fact, entirely fraudulent, she was as any savvy, if amoral, investor would, preparing to cut her losses. She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening, a new, hard, almost metallic glint in her eyes. "Richard," she said, her voice suddenly cool, clear, and utterly devoid of its earlier affection, "I believe my brother has made a rather compelling case. And I, for one, have no intention of going down with a sinking ship, particularly one whose captain, it seems, has been systematically drilling holes in his own hull." She then turned to her solicitor. "Mr. Thorne," she commanded, her voice now crisp, authoritative, "kindly review this trust agreement with me. And then, I believe, you and I will need to have a rather serious discussion about your less than thorough due diligence regarding Mr. Sterling's financial standing prior to advising me on this unfortunate marital entanglement." Thorne paled visibly. It seemed Clarissa was not just cutting her losses with Richard. She was already identifying her next legal and financial target. Richard Sterling stared at her, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending betrayal. The woman he had conspired with, the woman for whom he had, in his own way, risked everything, had just, without a flicker of sentiment, thrown him to the wolves to save herself. It was a brutal, but in its own way, perfectly symmetrical denouement. "Alistair," I said, turning to my own solicitor, who had been observing the proceedings with the quiet, detached interest of a seasoned naturalist watching a documentary on reptilian mating rituals. "Perhaps you and I could take a stroll in the gardens while Ms. Thorne and her counsel review the documents. I believe the air in this room has become a little stale." As we walked out onto the manicured lawns of the Sterling Manor, leaving behind the wreckage of my sister's wedding and her fiancé's life, a profound sense of weary, but deeply satisfying, closure washed over me. The harmony of Clarissa's special day had indeed been disrupted, but in its place, a different, more robust, and infinitely more honest kind of order had been restored. The band brother, the dusty lawyer, had not just crashed the wedding. He had, with the quiet, devastating power of a well-drafted legal brief, effectively repossessed his sister's future, saving her, in spite of herself, from the consequences of her own blind ambition. The final papers were signed an hour later. The wedding was officially and irrevocably canceled. The guests, who had been waiting in a state of confused and increasingly agitated anticipation, were informed of a sudden, unforeseen family emergency. Clarissa, her face a mask of cold, hard composure, departed not with her groom, but with her solicitor, her mind already, I was sure, focused on the next chapter of her life, a chapter that would be comfortably, if not lavishly, funded by the very brother she had so callously tried to exclude. Richard Sterling was left alone in the magnificent, empty library, a man stripped of his bride, his reputation, and his impending financial salvation, with only the ticking of the grandfather clock to accompany him in his ruin. The dossier on his fraudulent activities remained, for now, in my briefcase, a potent, unspoken threat, a guarantee of his future good behavior. My work here was done. The contract had been enforced. The liabilities had been contained. And the venue, my venue, had been cleared of its most undesirable tenants. Justice, like a complex real estate transaction, had, at last, reached a satisfactory and legally binding closing. The days and weeks following the non-wedding at the Sterling Manor were a period of quiet, systematic, and deeply satisfying legal and financial housecleaning. Alastair Finch, with his usual meticulous efficiency, oversaw the formal dissolution of Clarissa and Richard's brief and ultimately catastrophic engagement. The postnuptial agreement we had forced them to sign, which had now become a preemptive separation agreement, was executed without a hitch. Richard Sterling, stripped of his last-ditch hope of accessing my family's wealth through Clarissa, and faced with the ever-present, unspoken threat of my dossier being forwarded to the Serious Fraud Office, offered no resistance. He faded from our lives, his grandiose property development empire crumbling into a morass of lawsuits, bankruptcies, and disgruntled investors. Last I heard, he was living in a modest rented flat, his bespoke suits and sports cars replaced by a life of quiet, debt-ridden obscurity. A fitting, if not particularly dramatic, end for a man whose entire life had been a carefully constructed and ultimately unsustainable illusion. Clarissa, my sister, embarked on a new life, one funded by the generous but not extravagant trust one had established for her. The terms of the trust, as drafted by Alastair, were quite specific. It provided her with a comfortable income, enough for a respectable apartment, a sensible car, and a life free from immediate financial anxiety. It did not, however, provide for the kind of ostentatious, high-flying lifestyle she had so desperately craved. The funds were managed by a professional trustee, appointed by Alastair, of course, and any unusual or excessive expenditures required a formal, and usually unsuccessful, application. The days of impulse buying 5,000-pound handbags were definitively over. Her relationship with me, predictably, entered a new phase of cool, resentful formality. She accepted the terms of the trust, of course. She had little choice, but she did so with the air of a wronged princess forced to accept a handsome, but ultimately disappointing, consolation prize. We would see each other occasionally at obligatory family gatherings, where our conversations were brief, polite, and entirely superficial. The old dynamic of her condescension and my quiet endurance was gone, replaced by a new one, her barely concealed resentment and my quiet, unassailable position of financial and moral authority. It was not a warm relationship, but it was for the first time in our adult lives, an honest one, stripped of its illusions and false pretenses. The Sterling Manor, now free from the taint of Clarissa and Richard's ill-fated nuptials, flourished under my consortium's management. We brought in a new, professional team, renovated the historic buildings with a respect for their architectural integrity, and transformed it into one of the region's premier boutique hotels and conference centers. It became a successful and highly profitable venture, a testament to sound investment, careful management, and a vision that extended beyond a single, self-aggrandizing wedding party. My own life, in the aftermath of this rather dramatic family intervention, settled into a familiar, satisfying rhythm. My law practice continued to thrive. I took on challenging cases, mentored younger lawyers, and found a deep satisfaction in using my legal skills to bring clarity and order to complex, often contentious situations. The quiet, dusty work I had always loved had proven to be not just intellectually fulfilling, but also, in its own way, a formidable source of power and influence. I never remarried. The experience with Clarissa and Richard, and indeed my earlier, more painful divorce, had left me with a healthy skepticism about the institution of marriage and a deep appreciation for the quiet, uncomplicated pleasures of my own company. I had my work, my friends, my passions, a life built on my own terms, secure in its foundations, and free from the corrosive influence of other people's greed and ambition. One cool autumn afternoon, about a year after the non-wedding, Alastair Finch and I were having lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. "You know, Marcus," he said, a wry smile on his face as he swirled the claret in his glass, "I've handled some rather acrimonious family disputes in my time. But yours takes the proverbial biscuit. The sheer audacious elegance of using their own choice of venue as the instrument of their downfall. It was a masterstroke of situational leverage. Sun Tzu would have been proud. I simply nodded, a quiet smile of my own. They underestimated me, Alistair. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness, my professional focus for a lack of worldly understanding. It was a fatal miscalculation on their part. We raised our glasses in a silent toast. To meticulous preparation, to undeniable leverage, and to the quiet, enduring, and ultimately triumphant power of a well-drafted and strategically deployed legal document. Clarissa had wanted a harmonious, stress-free wedding, a day where her triumph would be absolute, her future secure. She had gotten, instead, a rather stark and very public lesson in the difference between ambition and avarice, between status and substance, between a carefully constructed illusion and the unyielding and often very expensive reality of contract. The wedding they had banned me from had, in the end, become a celebration of a different kind of union, the powerful and entirely satisfying marriage of justice and irony. And that, for a dusty old lawyer, was a memory to be cherished. The years that followed the dramatic unraveling of Clarissa's wedding were a period of quiet, almost anticlimactic normalization. Life, as it has a tendency to do, moved on, the sharp edges of past conflicts softened by the steady, erosive power of time. My law firm continued to prosper, and I found myself taking on more mentorship roles, deriving a quiet satisfaction from guiding the next generation of litigators, instilling in them the importance of meticulous preparation, ethical conduct, and the quiet power of a well-constructed argument. The sterling manor, under our consortium's stewardship, became a resounding success, its historic charm and modern amenities making it a jewel of the region, its balance sheets a testament to sound investment and professional management. It stood as a silent, elegant monument to the folly of those who had once sought to use it as a mere stage for their own vanity. Clarissa, my sister, eventually found a different, more modest path. The trust one had established, with its firm but fair terms, provided her with a stable, if not extravagant, foundation. Deprived of the ability to fund a lifestyle built on illusion, she was forced, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, to confront the reality of her own capabilities and limitations. After a series of short-lived, unfulfilling jobs, she surprised everyone by enrolling in a horticulture course. She discovered, it seemed, a genuine passion for plants, for landscape design, a talent that had perhaps been dormant, overshadowed by her more grandiose and less authentic ambitions. She eventually started a small, successful garden design business, her clients appreciating her keen eye for color and texture, her work characterized by a quiet beauty and a surprising practicality. Our relationship, while never regaining the easy affection of our youth, settled into a kind of respectful, if distant, truce. We would meet for occasional, brief lunches, our conversation carefully navigating the safe, neutral territories of our respective professions, the weather, the state of the nation's rose gardens. The past, with its raw wounds and bitter accusations, was a sealed archive, a collection neither of us had any desire to reopen. She never explicitly thanked me for the intervention that had, in its own brutal way, saved her from a disastrous marriage to a charlatan and forced her onto a more sustainable path. But I sometimes saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement of the new, more authentic life she now lived, a life made possible by the very brother she had once so contemptuously tried to cast aside. Richard Sterling, from what little I heard, faded into a well-deserved obscurity, his name a cautionary tale whispered in the city's financial and architectural circles. His empire, built on sand and deceit, had been washed away, leaving behind only the wreckage of broken deals and shattered reputations. As for me, my life continued on its steady, satisfying course. I found a quiet joy in my work, in my friendships, in the simple, enduring pleasures of a life well-ordered and free from unnecessary drama. I never remarried, content in my own company, my home a sanctuary of books, art, and the quiet hum of my own thoughts. The dossier on Richard Sterling, that potent weapon of leverage, remained locked away in a secure file, its purpose served, its contents a silent testament to a battle fought, and won, not with anger, but with information. The wedding invitation, with its tasteless gold calligraphy and its passive-aggressive prose, I had framed. It hung in my private study, a small, ironic memento, a reminder that sometimes the most profound opportunities are disguised as insults, and that the most satisfying victories are those born not of a desire for revenge, but of a quiet, unwavering commitment to principle and to the elegant, unassailable power of a well-executed legal strategy. My sister had banned me from her wedding, hoping to cement her triumph, to erase me from her narrative. Instead, she had handed me the keys to the kingdom, the opportunity to not just attend her celebration, but to fundamentally and irrevocably redefine its terms. And in doing so, she had, in the most ironic of ways, given me the greatest gift of all, the quiet, enduring satisfaction of justice, meticulously planned and elegantly, unforgettably delivered. The venue, in the end, had indeed been witness to a binding, life-altering union. Not a marriage, but the powerful and entirely satisfying merger of irony and accountability. And that was a contract I would always be proud to have executed.